Hey, I just wanted to talk to you today about the Apple Intelligence Beta 1. I made a video about it the other day that I posted on the channel, and I figured that today would be a good day to chat about my thoughts, um, which are pretty fully formed at this point. And um, they kind of boil down to this, which is that there's not much improvement from what we've seen in Siri in the past. So, in that video, if you watch it, there's lots of me repeating, lots of kind of text adventure type things where it feels like I'm trying to do something, but I'm sort of trying to reverse engineer what Siri is actually capable of at the given moment. Like, for example, I asked it to play Pocket Casts. I asked it to reach out to Austin and like record something about a sprint. I sort of stumbled over my language. Um, I asked it to give me my next OmniFocus item in a specific list. I asked it to summarize certain notifications. I sort of asked it to pull up certain voice memos. I asked it to share those voice memos with my Mac, uh, and kind of down the list, basically, from that point. Now, some of those requests were pretty impressive, actually. The ones I was most impressed by were the one where I was sort of rambling and stumbling over myself, and I asked it to remind me about a sprint and texting somebody about a sprint that they were on. And it wasn't perfect, but it was also sort of not super intelligible in terms of the thing that I gave. I sort of rambled, I changed the direction, I had sort of ambiguous language, and it still did a pretty good job of summarizing it. So I think that's what I'm going to push a little bit more on in the future and see if that kind of continues to be pretty good. And then the other one I was really impressed by was the fact that it was able to um, to do some of the voice memo stuff. While it wasn't capable of sharing the voice memos and pulling up the voice memos that I meant, it knew that it could open the app and kind of did the next best thing and said, okay, well, I can't do it, but I kind of know what you want. And then it sent me into the voice memos app to mostly take care of it, the rest of it myself. So still a little bit of a disappointment, but relatively good overall. Now, when I think about the things that are frustrating about what I just recorded, it was like the play Pocket Cast thing. Like that seems like it's just a pure failure. Like in previous versions, it's worked. I can maybe chalk that one up to like a beta. But really, I also pushed the bounds on some things that I knew it wouldn't be able to do yet, like the OmniFocus stuff. Show me the next OmniFocus thing, or even things like summarizing my text messages. Those are things that the final version of this first announced Apple Intelligence should be capable of come the time that those features roll out, which I'll talk more about later. Um, but importantly, Siri still doesn't have a ton of visibility into the apps that I'm actually using day to day. And so when I look at the way that Siri is, I don't know, implemented in this case, I start to get a little bit worried about the way that they have rebranded Siri so early. Like, for example, I asked Siri to order McDonald's for me, and it just said, go open the app. And that's sort of like the old way with Siri. What Apple Intelligence promises to do is to make it so that some of those things that you might be more instinctively predisposed to do should be easier for Siri to cover at least some of the bases for. So like showing me my next OmniFocus thing. That should be something that Siri does by the end of Apple Intelligence, assuming that the Omni group implements it with it. Even something like ordering McDonald's is theoretically possible to some degree and is already sort of possible with like shortcuts and the way that the old version of Siri works. But a more robust version of that is, I think, possible and kind of maybe on the horizon to some degree or another. Now, I don't know whether it will end up actually being implemented that way. I think that the big question I'm left with is, okay, they made it look pretty, but are the guts actually there? And with Apple, I'm sort of like, I am inclined to believe them. But ultimately, I think that what's going to happen in September, I guess October now, when a lot of this is released, is that a lot of people are going to see the new graphics for Siri. They're going to see the new beautiful animations. They're going to hear about this Apple Intelligence thing. And then they're going to try Siri. And even with the improvements that are going to be shipped throughout the summer, they may be underwhelmed again. And I think that that's a huge issue for Apple.
All right, Siri. So did you see the the Apple ad with the dude jogging?
Yes.
He's like, make this appointment. Oh, yeah, you got another appointment at that time. All right, move it to 2. Send a text message to my wife, blah, blah, blah. These things, the Siri thing is kind of cruel because people who watch this ad, and the ad is made to do this, people know that AI doesn't exist, artificial intelligence, but people watch this ad, even people who should know better, and they think it's AI, right? And it's not. And that's, I think, going to be a problem of expectations and reality. In reality, I think this thing will work great when you have a limited vocabulary and we have enough processing power to get recognition to work right. But it's going to work like a text adventure game where you have to learn the vocabulary. Like when you're a kid, you learn like, what do you know, move couch, or, you know, push lever, pull lever, use X on Y. You learn, when you're a computer nerd, you start learning the grammar that this game engine understands. And that's after 8,000 times of the game engine coming back to you saying, I don't understand X, Y. I don't know how to yank. I don't know how to leap. I don't know how to jump. Question not understood, command not. You go through a ton of that before you figure out the vocabulary of the game, so that when you're in the final dungeon or whatever, you can just rattle off the commands that you know will fit into the grammar of the thing. Siri has a grammar too. It has a set of things that it can do. It's more flexible than those old text adventure games. So you can phrase things in different ways and use synonyms and so on and so forth. But that's why it's an advance in technology. It's a better recognition engine. And by the way, it's not the speech component. As far as I understand, Siri came up with the part that figures out what the heck you're saying textually, but the speech recognition part that turns what you said into text commands is separate. So Siri is the thing that's trying to parse your English sentence. I don't know how I keep messing up. People are going to hear that and think it's speech recognition. But anyway, it's the understanding engine. But it is not AI. It will not understand you like a secretary would. It's not going to work like it does in that video, especially for regular people who don't know the vocabulary. Now, you're going to have 1 or 2 magical experiences where you say something and it happens to actually work, but you're going to spend a lot of time, I think, figuring out what you have to say. Now, this doesn't mean that Siri is bad. Siri is great because for the people who do learn the vocabulary, even if you just learn one piece of vocabulary, even if you just learn the reply to text message thing, that will let you reply to someone's text message without taking your hands off the wheel or without taking your phone out of your pocket, or look something up quickly if you just want to look up a restaurant. You don't want to type it out with your little thumbs. Once you learn those 1 or 2 little commands that you will actually use, it will be a great addition. And I think this is great technology, and it's going to make the iPhone 4S well worth buying over the iPhone 4. But you will have to learn those commands, essentially. It's not going to be a magical, helpful person that you talk to, and it's not going to be your secretary. And I fear that everybody watching that ad thinks it's going to be their secretary. And they're going to bring the thing home, and they're going to start talking to it, and it's just going to bounce right off of it because they have no idea what things it understands and it doesn't.
So before I dive more into my critique of what's going on with Apple Intelligence, and in particular with Siri, I want to tell you a story first. And it's a story that goes back to Jobs' return to Apple. So when Steve was fired, his reason for being fired was that he was very adamant about his vision for the future of the Mac in particular. And John Scully, basically brought it to the board and said, if the board doesn't support this, I can't get behind it because it's too financially risky. Jobs' original kind of philosophy behind this was that, well, we're on the bleeding edge of tech. Of course it's risky. Like, by nature, you may be on that, crest of the wave, and you may fall off. That's kind of what tech is all about. But that's also what makes it exciting. That is how you innovate. And there has to be somebody out there that's doing it and pushing the industry forward. Because the industry often doesn't do it itself. It takes much longer. It takes much more time if there's not a visionary who is saying, here's what I see and here's how to get there. The keeper and the reiterator of that vision was Steve Jobs. And he was fired because of it. And so he left and he started Next, and they tried to sell hardware and failed at selling hardware, and then realized they had this operating system that they could, kind of pull a Microsoft with and begin to license it out and maybe make some money with it. And, Eventually, Next had a little bit of success. It pushed some things forward. It started certain things in terms of standards, but really the real players in the tech space were still Microsoft and Apple, as especially in the PC space, as they really have been ever since. I think, when Jobs came back, he was famous for saying, Microsoft plus Apple equals 100% of the market, which, to a regulator maybe sounds a little scary, but to somebody who's looking to push things forward, it's actually a great news, because you really only need to convince one other company before you've got a standard and can really kind of begin to move things forward and have some assurance that, your innovations will spread throughout the industry. Anyway, that's beside the point. When Jobs came back, one of the very first things that they did, actually, let me explain a little bit before. The reason Jobs came back is because Apple bought Next. They needed a new operating system, and nobody was pushing the state of the industry forward except for, guess who? Steve Jobs. I know, big surprise. And so they bought Next, and Microsoft had pushed some things forward. They kind of had just caught up to the Mac, and they were moving at Microsoft pace, which is slower than Apple's pace, because they have less focus. And anyway, Apple bought Next, brought Steve Jobs on as interim CEO, and eventually said, guess what, Steve? You can run this company again. And one of the things that he was doing in that whole time period was really getting the underpinnings of Next as the future of the Mac platform. Steve Jobs called it kind of a brain transplant, and it was for the Mac. And so in the midst of this brain transplant, it started with the technology first. Now, very focused technology that was made to an end. If the Mac popularized the graphical user interface, the iMac and Next Step popularized, with many caveats, brought the idea of object-oriented programming and networked computing to developers and the masses alike. And so, as a part of that technological transition, Steve Jobs was very focused on the power of developers and the importance of developers. And so his whole spiel was that, guess what? We need to court the developers first. If we want a successful platform, well, we need the people to build for the platform, and therefore we need to build a computer and, more importantly, an operating system that can support what developers want. And in that time, one thing that developers really wanted is an easier way to develop, with fewer lines of code, with a simpler way to test, for example. And so that's what Next Step did. And that's what Next Step brought to Apple when they bought that company and brought on Steve Jobs, is the visionary who knew that the technology was important and knew how to find a market to build that technology for. And so they did. They did the brain transplant. And if you look at those early videos, one of these days I'll make a proper video about it, but if you look at those early videos of Steve Jobs coming back and showing kind of what was effectively the brain of Next Step that was ready to be transplanted into the Mac, it kind of looked a little more technical. It wasn't super pretty. It was a graphical user interface, but it didn't have the same conceptual clarity that the Mac did. It didn't have the beautiful icon design of Susan Kare. It didn't, it felt like a different company because it came from a different company. It didn't have the resources. It didn't have the time. It was a company that was fighting for its life, and so things were cut because of that. And so what happened was that is what was shown to the public, and more importantly to developers very early on in the product cycle for the Mac, and what would become Mac OS X. And, as things marched along, Steve kept showing little bits and these amazing little technical demos, and even some graphical things that kind of came along the way as a result of the new brain that the Mac was gonna have. And it was really exciting. Crowds ate it up when he would speak about it and show them what was going on. And then they got closer to release. And then they got to release. And guess what happened when Steve Jobs unveiled Mac OS X? In classic style, he sort of saved the best for last. He had one more thing that he wanted to do, and that was to make Mac OS X look beautiful. People who remember this era will remember Aqua. It took all of the graphics superpowers of this new brain transplant. It took all of those things that, you know, the average person probably didn't care about when it came to object-oriented programming, for example, and packaged it up in a nice, tidy bow that he called lickable. But really, it was just beautiful. And I think the order of that is worth investigating and comparing to Apple Intelligence, especially when it comes to Siri. Now, I'm not saying that Apple Intelligence is not profound technology. I'm not saying it is even further or not as far along than the brain transplant was when it came to Next Step. But, you know, by the time Steve Jobs had come to Apple, he, you know, was working at Next Step for almost 10 years at that point. Apple Intelligence is, you know, maximum a couple of years old. So I guess my point is that, you know, Steve Jobs worked on what is the important part of a tech company first, the tech. And he polished it off through that whole process of ideas and brought design, user-facing design, and developer-facing design too, to meet at a head, to show what the future of computing was in a beautiful, you know, almost maestro-like vision for launching a new era of computing that came with the iMac. And I don't think I'm overstating it when I say that. Here's the problem with what Apple's doing with Siri. Siri was launched to similar fanfare. In fact, Steve Jobs had a very heavy role in making the original Siri happen. In fact, it was released and then he died not too long after. And he knew it was artificial intelligence. He called Siri an artificial intelligence play for a very long time, and he meant it earnestly because the technology really was AI, just a very primitive version of it. But after Steve's death, I think that Siri sort of languished. There are some folks who argue that the thing that suffered the most after Steve died was the iPad. I would argue that it's Siri. It may just have been that the technology wasn't far enough along and that there was nobody to push it further, and maybe it wouldn't have even happened with him there. But the point is that while Siri has had these underpinnings for a while, one of the issues with it is that people don't really use it a ton. I mean, they use it, but it's not like the shining feature of the iPhone. It's not like the mind-blowing thing that, you know, we all thought it might become by 2024. And so, with the announcement of Apple Intelligence, you know, and Craig mentioning all the architecture and the rest of the company sort of getting behind this huge effort, there are a lot of promises of what will be possible with this thing. And what we've recently learned is that a lot of those technological lifts are still underway and that they will be coming down the pike still for the remainder of the year and deep into the next year, maybe as far as the next WWDC, so a whole year after. And if that's the case, then here's what's going to happen come October when this beta gets released to the public. People may hear about it. There might be some marketing push behind Apple Intelligence. People might understand that the new devices are some of the only ones that can run it because of the amount of computing power that it takes, and that will just be the discourse of the time. It'll also be one of the times where the marketing lands the hardest because it's the moment at which all the speak about these features meets the reality of a product actually shipping. And that's such an important moment. Now, that's what happened when Steve Jobs unveiled Aqua. He knew that there were eyes on the ball when it came to what was going on there. And he took advantage of that by, number one, making great technology. Number two, making a great product. And number three, doing a beautiful piece of marketing by centering the design as the thing that signified the change that was coming to the Mac. With Siri, that bit of design is the thing that's catching people's eye now, but it's shipping before the real technical work has been done. I think that that's a big mistake. I think it would have been enough for Apple to say, hey, we're launching this new platform. We think it's super cool. Here's the technology that powers it. This is a developer conference. And so you don't necessarily need to know what it's going to look like in the end. And in fact, maybe it would have just been like an upgrade to Siri. And guess what? Developers would have been happy about that. Hopefully Wall Street would have been pretty happy about that too. But that's not what happened. They kind of led with, yes, the philosophy, but at the same time announced the design, and sort of in doing so condemned themselves to launching the design before the technology was ready. And so my fear for them is that they may get to the point where they are underwhelming with Siri, just as they have in the past, and that Siri's reputation only doubles down on its inabilities rather than its abilities. And I really hope that that isn't the case. But it seems like that's what's going to happen. Anyway, those are my thoughts, a little bit rambly. I really, really, really have enjoyed posting again. I'm having a great time commenting with all of you down in the comment section. Some great points brought up on my last couple of videos, and they will wriggle themselves into a future video. Sometimes it just takes a little bit of time. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you soon, and more on Apple Intelligence and Apple Vision Pro coming up.